I'll tell you a truth history tried to bury. The West wasn't forged by the guns that fired, or the men who claimed the land. It was built in silence, in kitchens and cabins, in the trembling hands of women who learned to pray and fight at the same time. They were the unseen heartbeat of a land that pretended not to need them. They built the towns, the homes, the graves, and then were written out of their own story. The ballads sang of outlaws and empire. The statues praised the men who conquered. But behind every scar of that conquest was a woman, who kept something alive, a child, a dream, a fire that wouldn't die. No one wrote her name down. No one carved her story into stone. She was the shadow in the photograph, the whisper behind the preacher's words, the hands that stitched the torn edges of a world men thought they ruled. They cooked, they bled, they buried, they built. But when the songs were written their names weren't. They came west with nothing but hope and a shovel. They turned dry land into gardens, and silence into survival. They mended what gunfire broke. They loved men who didn't come home, and they stood by graves that had no markers because there was no one left to carve them. The men called themselves pioneers. The women called it another day to endure. They were the ones who nursed fever and fear in the same breath, who carried the weight of the West on their backs while history looked the other way. And when the world moved on, when the gold ran out, when the saloons went quiet, their names were the first to be forgotten. But forgetting doesn't mean gone. There are towns still haunted by their footsteps, doors that creak when no wind blows, stories that wake you in the night because somewhere in the dust, the past is still speaking. Listen long enough, and you'll hear them. The mothers who buried more than they birthed, the widows who built the towns men abandoned, the girls who learned to shoot because no one was coming to save them. History turned them into footnotes. But the West remembers. The land remembers the blood and salt in their sweat. The wind remembers the lullabies sung to empty cradles. The dust remembers every name that was never spoken again. They built the West, but history built walls around their names. And those walls stood for over a century, until the cracks began to whisper. Maybe that's what you're hearing now. Not wind, not ghosts, but memory trying to crawl its way back into the light. You see, history doesn't just forget, it decides who to remember. And what it decided was that men made the West. But that was a lie. The truth was quieter, harder, and far more sacred. It wore calloused hands and tired eyes. It prayed in the dark. It bled without witness. It lived and died without a name. That was the truth of the West. Not the gunfighters, not the gold, not the glory. The truth was the women who built a world that refused to see them. And maybe that's why the silence feels heavier here. Because every time someone forgets, another story dies a second death. So before you scroll past this, before you turn away like history always did, remember what was stolen from them. The songs never sang of them. The preachers never blessed them. The writers never named them. But they were there, in every mile of road carved through the desert, in every town that rose and fell like breath, in every grave that still bears no stone. They were the heartbeat under the gunfire, the mercy that followed the violence, the quiet that held the whole thing together. They built the West, and the West forgot them. But the forgetting ends here. Most people scroll past the women who built their world. Don't be one of them. Subscribe, or let their stories die again. They like to say the men went west to chase fortune, but that's not the truth. The women went first, not always with their feet, but with their faith. They dreamed the West into being long before a single wagon will touch the dirt. They saw land not as something to conquer, but as something to heal. History called them wives, or widows, or nothing at all. But they were founders, builders, dreamers who crossed into nowhere with everything they owned tied behind a mule, and everything they loved buried along the way. They came for freedom, not permission. They didn't wait for men to tell them where to go. They went where survival told them to. They left behind comfort and safety and names that meant something, and they traded them for land that broke them and remade them in the same breath. When the wagons rolled, it was their hands that held them together. It was their voices that sang through the night when wolves called from the hills. It was their fear light that kept the cold from winning. They built homes from nothing but mud, wood, and willpower. They raised families on ground that gave nothing easily. They fought drought, plague, hunger, and loneliness, not because they were following someone else's dream, but because they were building their own. They were the first to plant, the first to teach, the first to bury, and the last to give up. Every inch of the frontier was touched by their labor, watered by their tears, and held together by their endurance. When men rode off chasing gold or glory, it was the women who stayed. They mended fences, ran farms, delivered children, and stood in the doorway at night watching for someone who'd never return. They became the law when there was none. They became the church when no preacher would ride that far. They became the whole town in one body, because no one else would. And when the maps were drawn, they weren't marked. Their stories were written in dust, and the wine scattered the ink. But make no mistake, they didn't follow men west. They led. They were the compass when men were lost. They were the reason the wagons didn't turn back. They carried the children, the food, the faith, and still found the strength to bury the dead and keep walking. They came for freedom, not permission, and that freedom came at a cost, a body that aged with labor, a heart that learned to survive in silence, a name that would vanish from history's page. They were told they were just wives, just helpers, just mothers, but out there, in that vast and merciless land, being just anything could get you killed. So they became everything: farmer, hunter, healer, judge, builder, and though history forgot to write them down, the land didn't. Every old fence post, every broken foundation, every field that still blooms from soil once thought barren, all of it is marked with their memory. They were the spine of the frontier, and the silence that came after. They were the first to arrive, and the last to be remembered. And yet their story isn't gone. It's still here, breathing under the dust, waiting to be spoken aloud again. Because the truth always finds its voice. And the truth is this: the West didn't make them strong. They were strong long before they got here. The West had its gunfighters, its outlaws, its men of legend, but without the women, it would have died in its cradle. They gave the frontier more than survival. They gave it a heartbeat. They weren't written in the ledgers, but every town stood on their hands. When fever swept through the camps, it wasn't the doctors who came first, it was the midwives with nothing but herbs, hope, and courage. They boiled water, whispered prayers, and fought death with bare hands. They learned to heal without textbooks, to save lives the world didn't think were worth saving. They delivered children in storms and stillborn dreams. They patched up bullet wounds in backrooms, praying the law didn't find the blood before the mercy did. No medal, no title, no monument, just another dawn to face. They were the ones who stood between chaos and continuity, the reason the West didn't collapse into dust and memory. When men went chasing silver and sin, it was the women who kept the towns breathing. They taught letters and light in one-room schoolhouses. They turned barns into classrooms, corners of saloons into sanctuaries of learning. They raised generations who could read the Bible, write their names, and dream beyond the horizon. The world called them spinsters and schoolmarms, but they were builders of minds, keepers of civilization in a place that barely knew the word. And when men fell, when the whiskey, or the winter, or the bullet found them, it was the women who buried them, prayed over them, and rebuilt what was broken. They ran stores that became the heart of every town, selling food, fabric, and faith in equal measure. They extended credit when a man's pride wouldn't let him beg, and somehow still found a way to feed the hungry children he couldn't. The West pretended to belong to men, but behind every gun, there was a hand that had mended it. Behind every home, a woman who built it. Behind every life saved, a woman who refused to look away. They gave the frontier order, rhythm, mercy. They took a wilderness and called it home. They weren't chasing gold, they were planting roots. They didn't wear badges, but they kept the law alive in hearts. When justice failed in courts, they carried medicine in their aprons, scripture in their pockets, and stories that could heal more than wounds. And still history left them behind. The ledgers listed men who owned the land, but not the women who kept it alive. The records remembered the sheriffs and the gunslingers, but not the hands that stitched the bullet wounds. The newspapers printed the names of the rich and the reckless, but never the healers, the teachers, the quiet saviors who gave the West its soul. They weren't written in the ledgers, but every town stood on their hands. They were the breath between wars, the reason the graves had flowers, the reason the dying had comfort, and the living had hope. And even now, when you walk through those ghost towns, you can feel them. The warmth that refuses to die, the mercy that lingers long after memory fades, because they were the life of it all. The heartbeat beneath the dust, the ones who gave the West its pulse and its purpose. And when you forget them, you forget what the West truly was. You'll remember the gunfighters, but forget the hands that stitched the bullet wounds. Prove you care, subscribe. They called them fallen, but that was a lie whispered by men who feared the power of a woman who didn't need saving. They were the outcasts, the wanderers, the ones the church wouldn't bury and the town wouldn't name. Yet somehow, when the sun went down and the lamps went out, it was their light that kept the streets alive. The brothel owners, the saloon keepers, the laundresses, the women no one prayed for, but everyone depended on. They weren't saints, but they were necessary. When the world turned its back, they kept feeding it. When men spent their pay on whiskey, they were the ones who made sure the whiskey flowed. When miners fell sick, they were the ones who nursed them. When cow towns went broke, they were the ones who found a way to keep the doors open. They called them sinners, but sin built the schools. The money earned behind closed curtains built the first churches, the first roads, the first orphanages for the children no one else claimed. They bought land in their own names, something respectable women weren't allowed to do. They opened businesses, ran boarding houses, fed the hungry, and hired the lost. And still, when history wrote its pages, their names were crossed out before the ink dried. The men they saved were remembered, The towns they funded were celebrated, but the women themselves, buried under shame that wasn't theirs to carry. Respectability was a luxury they couldn't afford. Survival was the only law that mattered, and if survival meant sinning, they sinned with purpose. They learned the cost of independence, a cost paid in whispers, in stares, in loneliness, but they also learned power. They learned how to own land when men couldn't pay their debts. They learned how to count coin and influence in a world that pretended they didn't exist. They learned that salvation wasn't given, it was built, one hard-earned dollar at a time. These were the women who built empires out of exile. They took what the world called unholy and made it feed entire towns. They bought the lumber that built schools. They paid the wages that kept the sheriff's office open. They funded the preachers who condemned them from the pulpit. The same men who cursed them at dawn came knocking at their doors by night. The same towns that shunned them took their money when it was time to build something new. And through it all, the women smiled, because they knew what no one would ever admit. The West didn't survive because of purity, it survived because of those willing to get their hands dirty. They weren't saints, and they weren't monsters. They were women who refused to starve. They were the heartbeat of the saloons, the quiet strength behind the curtain, the backbone of a world that fed on hypocrisy and still needed saving. They were the reason the lights stayed on when faith flickered, the reason the town didn't die when winter came, the reason men came home instead of disappearing into the dark. They called them sinners, but sin built the schools, sin built the towns, sin kept the fire burning long after the good people went to sleep. And if you still think the West was won by clean hands, you haven't been listening long enough, because the truth is simple. The women who were cast out built the foundations that still hold everything up. The frontier had its heroes, but the outcasts built its empire. There's a silence even deeper than forgetting. It's the silence that comes when someone was never allowed to be remembered in the first place. The West was not white. It was a tapestry of tongues, colors, faiths, and hands, and the ones who held it together the longest were the ones history erased twice. The indigenous women, the Mexican women, the black women, the ones who carried the West on their backs, but no one carved their names in stone. They were born into a story that never intended to mention them. They raised towns that would not feed their children. They saved lives that refused to look them in the eye. They taught the language of survival to a world that would never call it wisdom. The indigenous women, they were here before any border, before any map. They carried the memory of the land in their blood. They watched as strangers renamed the rivers, burned the fields, and built churches where their ancestors prayed. And still, they helped. They nursed the same settlers who took their land. They traded, they healed, they taught. They made peace while watching their world disappear. And when they fought back, history called them savage. When they stayed silent, history called them gone. But they were neither. They were here, the first builders, the first mothers, the first to bleed for the land that forgot them. Then came the Mexican women, the ones who owned ranches before the border crossed them. They tilled soil their fathers named centuries before anyone spoke of manifest destiny. And when the flag changed, they were told to start over, as if they hadn't already built half the towns the conquerors claimed. They spoke two languages, one of survival, and one of silence. They kept businesses running when the men were drafted or jailed. They held communities together with nothing but work and prayer. They made the West bloom, and were paid back in prejudice. They carried the West on their backs, but no one carved their names in stone. And the black women, freed in name, but never in peace. They came west seeking freedom's shadow, only to find new chains made of law and skin. But they worked anyway. They opened schools when no one else would teach their children. They founded churches, ran boarding houses, and built towns that bore no color but dust. They fed soldiers who wouldn't salute them. They nursed the dying who wouldn't touch their hands in daylight. They cooked for towns that refused to share a table, but they kept building, because they knew that freedom isn't granted, it's grown. And they planted it, again and again, in ground that never wanted it to take root. These women, indigenous, Mexican, black, were not written into the legend. They were the legend, the keepers of life in a land that took everything from them, the ones who carried generations across deserts of cruelty and oceans of silence. The West owed them everything, but the history books gave them nothing. The men got the statues, the white women got the sympathy, and the rest, the ones who made it possible for any of this to exist, got forgotten. They carried the West on their backs, but no one carved their names in stone. They were erased by gender, then erased again by race. But the wind still carries their names if you know how to listen. You can hear them in the soil, in the songs without lyrics, in the way the land still breathes when no one is watching. They're still here, waiting for someone brave enough to say their names out loud. If you believe the West belonged to everyone, prove it. Hit subscribe before the silence does. There's a silence that follows being forgotten. It doesn't scream, it doesn't bleed, It lingers, like dust after a long wind, settling into the cracks of the world until the story beneath it can't breathe anymore. That's what happened to them. The women who built the West, they didn't vanish. They were buried alive in history. Every unmarked grave, every burned ledger, every diary lost to rain. It was a small murder of memory, and those murders piled up until the truth became unrecognizable. They were the backbone of towns that forgot their names, the midwives who delivered the children who'd grow up to call themselves founders, the cooks who fed the men who would one day write the laws that erased them, the teachers who taught boys to read, boys who grew up to write books that never mentioned their teachers at all. History didn't forget them by accident, it forgot them on purpose, because a woman who builds, heals, and survives, that's a dangerous kind of power. So the books called them wives, never founders, called them helpers, never leaders, and when they died quietly, because the world had already stopped listening. You can't erase a heartbeat, but you can bury it deep enough that no one hears it. Some of them tried to leave their mark, letters written in trembling hands, journals tied shut with ribbon, tucked into floorboards or buried under hearthstones. They wrote about the frost that killed the crops, the nights they held a dying child, the neighbors they fed when no one else would, the dreams they had of owning land, and the men who told them they couldn't. But those words never made it past the fires, the floods, the forgetting. Paper burns easier than guilt, and yet sometimes, pieces survive. A single page in a museum, written in a hand that history forgot to erase, a gravestone with the name chiseled too faintly to read, or a story whispered from grandmother to granddaughter, passed down through generations that refuse to let silence win. Because memory, real memory, doesn't live in books, it lives in blood. It survives in the way a woman still fights to be heard, in the way she still carries worlds on her back without asking for permission, in the way she still gets called too bold, too loud, too much. They think it's new. It's not. It's the echo of women who refuse to disappear quietly. The cost of being forgotten isn't death. It's being remembered wrong. It's being turned into a myth to make the truth easier to swallow. They weren't angels, and they weren't devils. They were something rarer, human, and history doesn't know what to do with women who are too human to worship and too strong to erase. So it does the only thing it can. It buries them beneath the stories of men who wanted to be remembered more. And over time, the ground hardens, the graves fade, the silence grows comfortable, and that's how forgetting wins, not with hate, but with quiet. But the ground remembers, the wind remembers, the land itself still carries their fingerprints, in the cracked well behind an old ranch, in the handmade nails holding up a schoolhouse, in the quilt found folded in an attic, stitched with initials no one can trace. You can bury a name, but not the work it left behind. That's the cruel truth of forgetting. It never truly works. The heartbeat keeps echoing beneath the soil. The dust keeps whispering. And when you listen closely, really listen, you can still hear it. The sound of a woman's voice, steady and low. I was here. I built this. You just stopped saying my name. The cost of being forgotten is knowing the world still stands because of you, but hearing only silence where your story should be. You can't erase a heartbeat, but you can bury it deep enough that no one hears it, until someone finally stops to listen. When the dust began to settle, and the towns started calling themselves civilized, the men did something quiet and dangerous. They didn't burn the women's stories. They rewrote them. That's the cleaner way to kill a truth. You don't silence it, you reshape it. The West that lived was rough, hard, and human. The West that survived on paper was clean, loud, and male. They wrote the women out, because they feared the story if it stayed whole. So the dime novels came first, books printed in cheap ink that turned struggle into spectacle. The men became outlaws and heroes, lawmen and legends. And the women, they were painted in the margins. The saloon girl with the heart of gold, the school teacher waiting for her cowboy, the widow who needed saving. The real women, the founders, the fighters, the ones who buried their children, and still built towns from mud and blood. They were too real for fantasy. And fantasy was easier to sell, because if men wrote the story, they could keep the power. They could turn a land built by women into a story about men who rode fast and shot straight. They could call it courage, while she called it survival. They could say they tamed the land, while she tilled it, planted it, and buried her dead in it. Then came the cameras. Hollywood put the lie on screen and called it truth. Black and white frames turned sweat into romance, struggle into swagger. They cast women as background, as pretty ghosts to stand beside the gunfighter, to die for his redemption, to fade so he could ride away. They called it the golden age of the West. But golden for who? Every story polished the myth and scraped away the truth, until the women disappeared entirely, and all that was left were guns, horses, and glory. And the world believed it. They forgot the sound of a woman's hammer striking a nail. They forgot the calloused hands that built the very towns they filmed in. They forgot the languages, the songs in Spanish, in Lakota, in Creole, the lullabies sung to children who would grow up never knowing their mother's names. They forgot on purpose, because memory is power. And if women remembered how much of this world they built, they'd never stop demanding credit for it. So men rewrote the West, and then they sold it. They sold it in theaters, in paperbacks, in bedtime stories told to sons who grew up thinking the world was conquered by six-shooters and smirks. They built monuments to myths and left no space for truth. And somewhere beneath it all, beneath the celluloid smiles and cigarette smoke, the real West still breathed. The one where women drove wagons through storm and hunger. The one where they stitched the wounds the legends left behind. The one where survival wasn't pretty, but it was holy. The West they buried under fiction never died. It's just been waiting, patient as the wind, for someone to dig it up. They wrote the women out, because they feared the story if it stayed whole. And maybe they were right to fear it, because a story that's whole doesn't ask permission, it demands reckoning. The truth doesn't vanish, it lingers, it whispers, it knocks on doors when the world's asleep. And tonight, it's knocking again. If this makes you angry, good, that means the West didn't bury you too. Subscribe and let's dig them up together. They never asked to be remembered, they just refused to be erased. That's the truth the legends never tell. The West didn't end when the gun smoke cleared, it kept breathing, through the hands of the women who refused to stop building. The saloons turned to storefronts, the dirt roads turned to highways, and the same earth they once tilled for survival now feeds the children of a world that never said their names. The towns that still stand, the ones with rusted signs, cracked windows, and ghosts in the corners, they're still built on her bones. Every brick that holds, every well that still runs clean, every song that still echoes through the hills, that's her handwriting. The women who once buried their dreams under dust are the reason those dreams didn't die. They kept building, even when no one was watching. They kept healing, even when no one said thank you. They kept surviving, even when the world told them not to. Time didn't erase them, it just changed their shape. They live now in the teachers in small desert towns, in the ranchers' daughters, who fix fences with their bare hands, in the nurses who drive through storms to reach a home off the map. The world calls it progress, but really, it's remembrance, because the same strength that built the first town still builds every quiet, stubborn act of hope today. They carried the West on their backs, and somehow, they carried us too. And though their names were never carved in stone, their work was. The wells they dug still run deep, the schools they built still stand, the prayers they whispered still hang in the wind. Listen closely, you can still hear them, in the sound of a hammer hitting wood, in the laughter of a girl who won't wait to be saved, in the whisper of the wind brushing through dry grass, saying, keep going, because they did. The West they built never died. It stands every time a woman refuses silence. It breathes every time someone tells the truth without fear. It grows every time someone remembers that history is not a monument, it's a heartbeat. And though history tried to bury them, the ground they walked on still holds their memory, strong, steady, and unbroken. They never asked for fame. They never asked for statues or songs. They only asked for the right to live, to work, to build, to exist without apology. The West they built still stands. It stands in the quiet dignity of survival. It stands in the courage of those who came after. It stands, not in marble, but in marrow. It stands because they never let it fall. And if you listen to the wind long enough, you'll hear them still. The women who refused to disappear, they never asked to be remembered. They just refused to be erased. The wind never stopped speaking, it just learned to whisper through the places we stopped listening. Across the plains, through the ghost towns, over the graves, you can still hear it. The creak of a broken sign, the rattle of a loose window, the sigh that slips between the old boards of an abandoned house. It isn't emptiness you're hearing, it's memory. The women who built this land never left it. They walk still, not in body, but in the weight of everything they touched. Every fence post, every well, every brick in a town that still stands, that's them. They're the dust that never settles, the warmth that clings to a fire long after the flame is gone, the steady hand guiding every woman who learns the cost of her own name. They aren't in the history books, they're in the wind that moves across the fields, in the quiet strength of a woman standing alone, in the echo of a voice that says, keep building, keep breathing, keep remembering. The men conquered the West, the women made it worth living in. That's the truth the legends never told. Because the real West wasn't built on victory, it was built on endurance, on hands that wouldn't stop working, on hearts that wouldn't stop hoping. So when you pass a forgotten grave, or drive through a town whose name no one remembers, listen, the wind is still telling their story, and if you stay quiet long enough, you'll hear it say, We were here, we built this, we lived. The West they built still stands. Not in monuments, but in the spirit that refuses silence. The same spirit that still burns in every voice that dares to remember them. You can ignore this, pretend it's just another story lost to time. Or, you can hit subscribe and carry their story forward. One choice makes you part of history, the other makes you its silence.